Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good evening. I'm Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight for our LaRouche PAC Strategic Overview for December 12th. And we have a lot to cover tonight. The developments in the world are quite enormous, and we should start off with what we want to get across, as you will hear from Michael Steger, who is joining me and who will give our overview tonight, really gets to the question of how truth will prevail and is currently prevailing as we are continuing to gain a deeper insight into the corruption and criminality that has been ongoing in the coup, which LaRouche PAC has warned about and has been very much on top of for a very long time, that is being exposed right now, as many people know from what we will discuss, and you'll hear more from Michael in a moment here as to what we should come to understand about what everybody's being bombarded with, known as the Twitter files. And after the takeover of Elon Musk, who many can say is a truth seeker. He's not just someone who took over Twitter, billionaire, a entrepreneur, or someone who loves rocket ships, but understands that we're getting at something deeper here, as we expressed in the write-up in terms of developing this discussion for tonight. When you think about what is being developed from these Twitter files and the understanding that this has been an outright target on by the criminal intelligence community and others, not just on Donald Trump, which we'll talk about shortly here, but also on the American people. But I think the key, as LaRouche PAC has very much uniquely been discussing, is what we want to create in terms of a future orientation to build out the type of growth which is going to emerge from once and for all putting an end to this criminal deep state globalist system. And the key to that is that we have to understand what Donald Trump represented. And one of the reasons why LaRouche PAC, and Michael was very instrumental in helping to draft this report, was one of the first political entities to endorse President Donald Trump, is because we understand, going back for a very long time, going back to the operations run against President Trump in his 2016 campaign, also in 2020, when we warned and exposed the role of the deeper operations against President Trump coming from the House of Lords report, and the fact that under no circumstances were they going to allow Trump to have a second term in office. And I wanted to bring that into the discussion because I think it gets deeper than to the point of there are now 5 sets of Twitter files that have come out that detail many different operations that have been run, not just against Trump, but against the American people, the whole question of misinformation. But I want to pose in that context a question to Michael, because in the opening, or as we developed in the statement to be put out, discussing the subject matter of this talk tonight, that what you are developing is the idea of the period ahead requiring something that has never existed before. And you describe this as an artistic creation in the medium of political freedom, which together we will build a movement that governs the nation as statesmen, scientists, and true artists. And I think that's very provocative, because in that context, while everybody's been focusing on the just being bombarded by what has been a total corruption coming from the deep state operations, as they've been known, or globalist operations. What people are not being told is the positive of new breakthroughs and developments that are underway that are going to propel mankind forward. And we've seen this, and this has been a direct correlation to the role of President Trump. For example, this weekend, we experienced the end of a 25-and-a-half-day mission of the Artemis program, the first stage of Artemis 1, which was initiated under President Trump to send for the first time human beings to the moon since 1972. But we just saw the completion of the test mission of Artemis 1, and people can read. I'll post in the Slack, I'll post in the chat here an article that I just wrote. And on that mission, we just saw the splashdown of the mission after 25 days, and we'll learn of the science in this test mission that's preparing the way for human beings to go to the moon, and not only go to the moon and return to Earth, but go to the moon and build out base camps and long-term presence on the moon, paving the way to Mars. This is some of the developments going on. As a matter of fact, Mr. LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, would always talk about the importance of achieving the developments or the goal of reaching more energy into the system than out of the system than we put in. And for those who have been told that fusion energy is always 30 years away, well, we should know now that as the enemy of human progress has tried to keep those developments from happening, they're now pushing forward and underway, as we just learned that the National Ignition Facility, Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, has achieved some success in reaching the goal in fusion energy and bringing more energy out of the system than put in. And we'll hear more about this soon. So I think that gets to what you want to develop here tonight. And I want you to just kind of take that up a little bit more, Michael, what more we should think about coming out of these Twitter reports as Twitter files, more so as the key to the end of a system and what must emerge as a new system. So I'll let you go ahead and take that. All
Thanks,
right.
Keisha.
Great.
All right. So, I mean, the reason I had
1 second here.
Sure.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I think as many of you on this call may know, and maybe some of you are getting on for the first time, but anyone in this country with one eye open and has watched what's taken place politically in the recent period, in the last year or two, and certainly if you've watched or have some sentient memory of the last 20 years, you realize that this is not merely a question of electing a president. I mean, the clearest example for that would be 2016. We elected a president. It's not merely a question of not having a decent candidate or an ability to send a message. The political establishment has no regard for the message of the American people. So we're going to have to do more than just send a message. You're going to have to accomplish nothing less than taking power in the country. Now, how does a movement take power? Well, the way our Constitution was shaped, which is itself an act or is an artistic work. Right? If art is something that the human mind can can capture and identify as true in the universe, but has not yet been made manifest. So it's not merely an imitation of nature, but it's the capturing of that process of the universe uniquely accessible to the human mind that we then make or demonstrate effectively to human society. You might think of an ancient Greek sculpture, the Dome of Florence, a Rembrandt painting, where there's a quality of principle captured, a kind of breakthrough that gives you a different sense of humanity, and in doing so, a different sense of humanity, a different sense of the universe itself. Our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence accomplish the same. Nowhere before was the idea of asserting the equality of human beings ever made manifest as the foundation for political power. Never before. And yet it's a true principle. And the irony of it is that nowhere can you find two people who are exactly equal. That doesn't exist. There are no two things of any nature, no two grains of sand. There are no two atoms, no two electrons, which are entirely equal in every way. So I'll come back to that point to develop it a little bit more. It's not meant to just be an abstract concept, but it serves as that abstract concept to say, what are we asserting then is something of a principle only accessible to the human mind and only accessible in principle. And our founding fathers built a government and essentially shaped it around an institution of the presidency. And if you've watched our recent presentations by Bob Ingram, what you find is that the Jefferson crowd, the Thomas Jefferson cabal around Madison, Monroe, and other Virginia factions, or a faction of Virginians plus others, they wanted to tear down, and this quickly became associated with people like the Martin Van Buren, Aaron Burr, Andrew Jackson crowd in New York. They wanted to immediately, as soon as Jefferson came back from France to serve as Secretary of State, wanted to destroy the institution of the presidency, and even to a large extent, the Supreme Court as well. They wanted a purely legislative body, which would have ultimately just failed because there was no one person accountable to lead the country. But it's not just a person, it's an institution. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche oftentimes referred to as an institution of the presidency. So our founding fathers knew that in principle, whether it's stated explicitly in the documents themselves is not the point. The point is that the means by which they constructed our government and how it came to exist was through a kind of principle, a kind of building a political movement, which was in a sense mobilizing the American Revolution, which began as early even in the 1750s. In the Albany Congress was in the 1750s. So our 20-year period of development to spark what then became a successful revolutionary fight, that principle was embodied in the nature of the institution of government itself. Now, the thing that's challenging is that when this is replicated, whether it's in the Civil War, whether it's in the mobilization to address the Great Depression and World War II, that it's never able to be replicated in the same way it was before. As any work of art, merely imitating a previous work of art will not accomplish the quality necessary to create a new sense of human identity. But nothing less, and I'll make the case why, nothing less than this kind of political movement around a presidential campaign, as with Trump's, as he himself has called for, is sufficient to address this moment. Yes, the Republican Party needs to be shifted. Yes, we need election integrity. But the problems that exist are not as an origin, as cause, cannot be found in the Republican Party, nor will you find the causes of the decline of our nation and our civilization in election integrity. These are symptoms. And I think we all know, and we all now deal with the medical issue in a totally different way. Cause matters. Dealing with cause is not only the most effective way of dealing with something practically, it is also the most inspiring thing, the most uplifting method of bringing in future generations into a similar cultural participation, to buy in, as you might say, to get skin in the game. They see that, wait, we're going to actually address the fundamental underlying questions. Okay, so why might we say that this kind of movement is necessary? I'm not here to say I know exactly how to build the movement. I'm not saying you should know. What I am asserting is that you should be participating. We, all of us at this point, should be resonating that a movement of this quality is what's necessary around the Trump campaign, not to get him merely elected, but to bring it to power, and in bringing it to power, to clean out the courtiers and the sadists and the perverts and the bureaucrats and the careerists that have come to dominate Washington, D.C., which should be a temple to truth and liberty, not a house of ill repute. So we're here to make the case that there is nothing more important at this point in time. We have an evaluation of the election. Everyone on this call, anyone involved in politics, has their own assessment at this point of how this midterm process unfolded. There are many problems, but we are where we are, where we know what's necessary. And some might say it's necessary to get Trump elected. True, but was that enough in 2016? Even if his second term, he's more unleashed because of a lack of needing to get reelected. That still isn't going to make the fundamental difference. We have to staff this government. Trump's talking about bringing in 50,000 more people, new people into government, cleaning out some of the nest. So, but let me make a deeper argument. If you look at the Twitter files that have been released, probably most of us are not too surprised. What may be surprising is the overt direct coordination by the Office of Director of National Intelligence, even if that was run by a Trump appointed and somewhat loyal figure. I forget his name now. But you had offices in the DHS. We saw this during the post-election period. You saw FBI figures, not surprising. We just found out Jim Baker, a major factor in the Russia coup against Trump, was moved from the FBI in 2018 directly to be the top guy at Twitter, and was still there today, 4 years later. But what you see is a direct manipulation of any sense of rules or principles that Twitter may have had, which they stuck to. The fifth tranche of the Twitter files was released today, and it makes it very clear. Trump didn't violate any of the rules. Let's ban him anyways. Everybody's screaming for it. A bunch of Twitter employees were screaming for it. All of the mainstream media is screaming for it. Everybody in Washington screaming for it. Let's just ban him. Screw the rules. Screw the principles. Screw anything. Even some people inside Twitter said, this seems a lot like China. We're replacing Trump's tyranny with our own. These kinds of comments, they saw that, but it didn't matter. Now, Twitter is not a social media entity. It is an intelligence operation. It was not merely maybe set up. Silicon Valley works in a bit of a petri dish kind of way, but it was certainly boosted and deployed by the intelligence services as early as 2010 into places like Iraq, Iran, and then throughout North Africa, into Syria and Ukraine during the Arab Spring period. And it was specifically used by the intelligence services. A lot of the hardware was likely built out. because this is an ability to control narrative. It's part of a psychological operation, which is practically every factor of our culture today is part of this psychological operation. Social media was a newfound way of collecting massive amounts of data on people, and then also manipulating what they had access to. But that suggests something even deeper. I think many of you may know that. But the question is, what kind of society tolerates and permits this level of overt control and disregards all of the principles of the basis of a republic and constitutional law? Well, as it's been pointed out by journalists like Glenn Greenwald and others, this is something that, and as LaRouche PAC and LaRouche as a presidential candidate made very clear, I think far more profoundly than any journalist, that the Patriot Act and other measures following 9/11 were an explicit and gross violation of the US Constitution, and would ultimately be applied, as they were, very quickly, not just to massive information and gathering of foreign nationals, but of the American people in gross, massive data collection. This was overt policy by our government in direct violations of 4 or 5 of the various Bill of Rights. So something else was taking place. That something else was, again, echoed, to tease the point here a bit, by Angela Merkel just over the weekend, where she said that all of the negotiations with Russia over Ukraine, called the Minsk agreements going back to 2014, 2015, were done ultimately in bad faith. Now, that may be something she's now saying to try to exempt herself from any actual negotiations with Russia, that she's diving entirely into the swamp and bathing in the excrements. But it also is meant to sour any sense that Russia or any nation that has any major disagreement with the United States or any of its vassal states at this point of Europe or anywhere else cannot trust the negotiation at all. That she's admitting what we do is lie. Overtly, we lie and convince you based on your own trust and sense of good intentions and what might be fair and just, but we're going to explicitly abuse that for practical power. That truth means nothing. This outlook, this ideology, was the dominating factor of the Bush, the 43 regime during 9/11 and afterwards. People like Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, and a number of others, what were oftentimes called Straussians, because they studied under a philosophical figure at the University of Chicago who taught 2 different outlooks. So some people that studied under him may be halfway decent because he taught them that one should be noble, one should have character, one should regard truth as the highest question of value and measurement. But he taught a whole other faction that that's just a nice sounding idea, that actual civilization requires people to deceive to maintain power structures, that to lie is a necessary factor to mislead, to manipulate, to control behavior, to cull people, is a necessary question to maintain the power structure. Committing crimes, being evil is necessary to hold our civilization together. And he didn't make that argument from like a Nietzschean standpoint, where Nietzsche hates Socrates, he hates Christ, he hates the concept of truth. It was a much more refined argument, which you might find in some of the radical left today. It was a much more refined argument that this is actually the view of Plato, of Socrates. That they were aware of what is an argument early on in Plato's Republic, when a character named Thrasymachus says, ultimately might makes right. What's true? Well, that is true is what's declared by those in power. That might make something true and correct. Not a universal principle. It's this level of corruption that made its way to the highest levels of our government, unabetted or unopposed. And the Democrats, or ultimately the second head of that two-headed hydra of the Uniparty, went along with entirely. As Nancy Pelosi said, impeachment's off the table. We're not challenging this criminal cabal at all. Lyndon LaRouche PAC did challenge this. We exposed what I just went through and this insidious quality of deception and lies, which is what the Iraq War was, which is what the manipulation of the Arab Spring, which is the premise of this entire Ukraine war, which was the premise of the entire attack on Trump, or that Russia meddled in our democracy. All of this has been introduced, which is nothing less than a satanic conception of human civilization, or a way of destroying civilization. And at core, this is what's rotting. This is what rots FTX. The entire crypto Ponzi scheme is premised on, it doesn't matter if it has no value. If people will give money for it, it has value. Who cares if it's just a scheme and a fraud? And people think, well, how could possibly people at the highest levels think this way? Well, they have been demonstrably for at least 20 years. And you could probably say, after the Cold War and the introduction of the Clinton administration, who lied incessantly, as did Obama, this is what we've come to. And the forces aligned against us are not necessarily a unified force of people who have a common mission. They have a common agreement to defend their right to lie, to maintain power at any cost. Now, this is not new. This is the model of the Roman Empire. It's essentially the same arguments made by Thomas Hobbes as he defended the Restoration Crown, or John Locke in the Revolution of 1688 that became the dominant British imperial model. So leading philosophers taught in every university. Before there was woke, there was still fascists like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke taught in every university in the country to any political science, philosophy, or pre-law student. The intent to rip this quality of truth out of civilization is not something new. It is as ancient as human civilization itself. But what has defined the advancement of civilization has been the capacity of a people to recognize at certain critical points that such truth, the concept of truth, as developed by Plato and Socrates, as developed by Christ in the Gospel of John, as reemerges in the Renaissance period with the reemergence of Plato's original writings, that this higher question creates the most noble levels of sacrifice, whether it was the Christian martyrs in the pit of Rome, or if it was the pilgrims and others who founded the colonies that grew up into be a new kind of nation, premised on a sense of principle, not lineage, of family wealth and control. But this is what they're looking to tear apart. And the election of Trump is not merely an election to reject bad education at schools or an open border, but that it has got to be to restore these conceptions, not, and I would make the argument, not merely implicitly. Maybe that's not Trump's role to make that argument as a presidential candidate. And he will in his own way, I think. But it is for a movement to be built around these conceptions, which have been the defining hallmark of the advancement of our civilization itself. Because we are dealing with something far more evil than simply even the lockdowns and deception of COVID, which is, again, another clear example of let's lie, as was admitted by Fauci and others. I lied about masks, for example, because we didn't have enough masks, or because of this. Because I said this simply to get an effect of behavior for the moment, that I'm unaccountable to what's true. And many people recognize this. They'll talk about it and go, this is really a problem. Journalists have no idea that truth matters anymore. Okay, but can we survive as a people without such a conception? Now, what's interesting, as Keisha pointed, we are looking at an era at the same time where such a movement is bolstered by ongoing advancements in scientific thought and technology and space exploration, fusion power, the Project Prometheus and the expansion and rebuilding of our country. The Project Artemis is ongoing, all of which Trump really accelerated. And you also see this breakthrough with Twitter, where now basically an intelligence agency under a different name is now no longer under their control. It's under a kind of an iconoclastic billionaire who likes to basically thumb his nose at these kind of pragmatic liars who simply can't help themselves but lie perpetually and incessantly. He's kind of sick of it himself, as are many people. You know, Elon Musk was invited onto stage with Dave Chappelle last night in San Francisco. He got booed massively by the crowd. Dave Chappelle said it was all the people in the cheap seats. Maybe true. But the point was, Dave Chappelle's sick of it. There are a lot of people sick of it. And they haven't spoken out maybe as much because they didn't have the strength or courage of Trump. But they're bolstered by the constant ongoing level of changes and pushback that this MAGA movement has helped to lead. And so we're at a point where there are breakthroughs in the control of the propaganda machine. That radio control, you might say, of messaging is not entirely controlled by the enemy at this point, that things are beginning to open up. It doesn't mean that the content is necessarily there to win, but the means to communicate the content. I mean, the fact that Trump may change tweets to 4,000 characters may be the biggest change of all, because now you actually have to say something. You can't just be a snide commenter. You have a chance and really a responsibility then to say something. Otherwise, why read what you're saying? So, but my point isn't to focus on Twitter per se, but to recognize that there are clearly shifts taking place already, as Trump has announced his campaign, where we can get a sense that this movement is already starting to express itself as an ability to recruit not merely the MAGA base, because certainly Musk and Dave Chappelle and people like Joe Rogan are not the MAGA kind of productive class of the country. They're celebrity starlets of various forms. But they express a different part of the population who maybe they aren't necessarily on board with the kind of changes that are necessary. But now they're going to be confronted with ongoing paradoxes in their very distorted worldview. When that framework of perspective starts to change, when people who have believed in the COVID agenda, who have believed in the financial institutions, who believed in tech and Google and all these so-called gadget advancements as somehow cultural progress, when that begins to break apart, we're going to have to replace that worldview, which is one artificially created, with a real one premised on the ability to come to know truth and a method to achieve that. That's why we still think of Plato today, because he also recognized that same question. It's why we say modern science began around the 16th century, because it was introduced not by the Galileos that are often referenced, but by people who were willing to sacrifice and devote themselves to truth, not to mathematical description, but to real discovery of the universe and how it functions. And that would be measured by the improvements to society itself. So that to me seems where we are. I hope many of you agree, but I'd like to hear what you're thinking and questions on your thoughts, on your mind. And so, Keisha, I'll basically end my comments there, see what people are thinking, and get into the dialogue.